Hi everyone, I'm Katie Price, Curator of Collections here at the Williams College Museum, and I'd really just like to welcome you all here. Welcome to WICMA, welcome to Williamstown if you haven't been here before. I hope all of you have been able to see the exhibition that this program is centered on, Warhol by the Book. It's a large show and it will be on view here for a few more weeks, and we're just really very happy to have had it here for all of these months, and can't believe it's coming to an end. So this is the second of our summer series of Warhol and Conversations. These sort of informal, fun, deep dives into one aspect of Warhol's life and career. And I'm really just so pleased to have Nina Schleif and Blake Gopnik with us this evening. There will be a reception after outside on our patio, so please join us after that, after this conversation, for some drinks and food and some more conversation with Blake and Nina. I'm really excited about this program in particular, Warhol in the 1950s. I think this is one of the sort of decades and periods in Warhol's life and career that is, I think, for all of us, all of visitors to this exhibition, probably least, we know least about in terms of, things that we're still trying to put pieces together from this period of Warhol's career. And it's really a surprise to visitors, I think, many of whom aren't as familiar with this decade of his work. I'm just honored to have Blake and Nina here with us today, two people who know so much about Warhol. Nina Schleif is an art historian and curator who has worked at the state museums in Munich, including the Alte and Neue Pinakothek, and she was most recently senior curator at the Brandhorst Museum in Munich. This past year, Nina has actually been in residence at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., where she's been a senior fellow of the Terra Foundation for American Art. A few years ago, in 2013, Nina curated a very important exhibition called Reading Andy Warhol at the Brandhorst on Warhol's bookwork. And she was editor and author and curator of that important exhibition. We're selling the catalog in the shop, and I think there might be one copy left. It's been very popular. You can probably buy it online, but I've been joking that we didn't have to do a catalog for this show because Nina did such an amazing job with that catalog. And I just want to say that there are a few authors from that book here tonight, but I have to say that this show would not have been possible without Nina and that exhibition that you did. So I just want
Vice versa.
Well, and I want to thank you just for your wonderful collegiality and kindness and generosity. You've been so wonderful to work with over the years. And I'm happy to say that Nina is currently working on a book manuscript on Warhol's drawings from the 1950s and has done some really wonderful, really original research. So, Blake Gopnik has written widely on art and many other topics over the years. He's worked at numerous publications in Canada and in the United States, and for over a decade he was chief critic at the Washington Post. Blake has also been the art and design critic at Newsweek magazine and its Daily Beast website. He's currently critic at large for artnetnews.com, and is a freelance writer for the art newspaper and for the New York Times, where he's a regular contributor. Blake is writing the first comprehensive Warhol biography, and so he is absolutely and completely, I think, saturated with Warhol at this point and can tell us lots of what he's learning and digging up in his research. That biography will be published by HarperCollins, and then this year, Blake is also a research fellow at the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the City University of New York Graduate Center. So I'm just thrilled to have you both here. Thank you so much for being here, and I turn it over to you. Please join me in welcoming Nina and Blake.
Thank you.
May I just say a word of thanks to Katie for inviting us first? And congratulations on this amazing exhibition. There are over 400 objects in this exhibition, And anybody who's ever dealt with material like this, you know, three-dimensional objects and books where you can only open one page at a time, it's an amazing job she's done. So this is really a very unique and wonderful exhibition, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, and you too. So
yeah, I spent 6 hours here, and I thought I'd finished with it, and I came back today. This was a couple of months ago. I spent 6 hours, and I realized, oh no, I need to spend another 6. It's a kind of endless exhibition.
Yeah.
Endlessly giving exhibition.
Yes, even for people who think they know Warhol, that was my experience with many people walking into this exhibition, looking especially at the early stuff, at the 50s stuff. They said, oh, I never really liked Warhol, but this stuff, I really like that. So that's really what this exhibition is, I think, very successfully doing, is inviting more people to take a closer look at Warhol. And we talked earlier today, and we said, you know, there are so many myths about Warhol and so many general conceptions about Warhol. And, you know, we're the next generation, basically. I don't think you ever met him.
Nope,
I never met him, so we're the generation past Warhol. And it's maybe time to take another look and discover new aspects, and there are so many to discover.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most of the things you think you know about Warhol are mistaken. So you can imagine that everything you think you know is mistaken as well. It's one of the terrors of working on Warhol, is all of your assumptions have to be thrown out the window.
It's also one of the joys, because it never gets boring. We were talking about that earlier. There's so much humor, so much fun in his works that it just keeps you involved, and you sit there chuckling to yourself with many things, and so he's just great to be working on.
Now, something you just said, I think, brings us to something we wanted to discuss, and it's very important, which is the extent to which people love this early work who actually don't much like some of the more radical later work. And I think it's important in looking at this work, in understanding how it relates to the later work, and my opinion is that there's more radicalism here than it seems. And it's a mistake to see this as an example of Warhol as really an old-fashioned artist who either goes wrong or sort of goes mildly right in '62. It's very important to understand Warhol and avant-gardism, I think. And we wanted to talk a little bit today about the relationship between Warhol of 1962 and Warhol of 1952.
Right. But do we want to go, how far back do we want to go? Do you want to say a few words about Pittsburgh and its contact with avant-garde?
Yeah, I think that's an important starting point. I mean, and sort of a through line in my book is, or I should say will be, that Warhol was a really dedicated and very old-fashioned modernist avant-gardist. He believed in making it new more than anything. And when you look into his education in Pittsburgh, it's extraordinary. He was exposed to every possible facet of radical early 20th century art. And I think that sets a model for how he thinks about making art for the rest of his life. So it's important to recognize that, and then to, in fact, look at this 50s material as, in some ways, instantiating the radical, even though I think a lot of his colleagues, his peers in the 50s, couldn't see his radicalism that was happening.
Yeah, but this aspect that you were talking about, that he's always keeping an eye open to what's going on in the avant-garde scene, but also in traditional art history, he's always keeping an eye open. He's informed, he goes to galleries, he goes to museums, he sees the exhibitions, and that's one, to me, really surprising aspect in Warhol scholarship, really, is that very rarely is he discussed in art historical terms, in that he's, you know, positioned in an art historical frame. That means, you know, he's doing this one particular work at this specific time. You know, what would he have seen at that time in the galleries or in the museums? And it's amazing how, in my book, traditional, he really does his work, he does his research, and even though some of the, especially 50s works, look so, you know, flimsy or, you know, just spur of the moment kinds of works, if you take a closer look, you will discover endless associations you can have and discover. And that to me was really surprising, even after having worked with his work for a while, for a number of years.
Let me give a nice little example that I've discovered in my work. The very, very 1946 drawings, which I guess are maybe the earliest works in the whole show, which are the drawings he did from the back of his brother's produce selling truck. They went door to door in Pittsburgh, which in Pittsburgh was totally normal. They were called hucksters, and that didn't mean anything bad. That was not pejorative. And Warhol, because he'd failed his first year drawing actually at Carnegie Tech, he was known as a bad draftsman compared to the other kids around him, was forced to do a sort of makeup during the summer. And he did these drawings, and they're gorgeous, incredibly fluid things, and so much better than what he'd done before. And everyone always says it, they celebrate it. And then when you look through the lists of exhibitions that happened in Pittsburgh, the crucial exhibition is a Daumier exhibition that happens that January. And as soon as you realize that, if you compare those drawings to Daumier, you realize that Warhol suddenly is just channeling, in a sense, the latest art that he and his peers and his teachers saw, and realize, well, if I make it look like that, then I'll pass and I'll get back into school. The resemblance between certain, we don't know exactly what was shown there, but some of those drawings are so close to certain Daumiers that it's just incredible. And I think you can find links like that throughout almost his whole career.
I find it really hard to believe that the early drawings, they're just when the exhibition opens here, when you first enter, it's watercolors, and these line drawings are so accomplished, so it's really hard to see how a teacher would say, no, your drawing style or your drawing technique is not up to par. Also, what he does with the watercolors, I think, is so, the colors he chooses and how he juxtaposes them is so accomplished. For someone who's just starting out, and my first thought was maybe he'd seen the watercolors of Demuth. We talked about him too, but Daumier seems to be someone where he picked up the line, the fluid line, and
the subject matter too.
Right.
The subject matter in the ones in Pittsburgh were all these scenes of sort of Parisian shopkeepers, and there's one image about women where Daumier asked women not to squeeze the vegetables before they buy them. And Warhol, in an interview that happens, because he wins a prize, gets interviewed in the local newspaper, talks about women squeezing vegetables. And it would be classic Warhol when he's on the spot being interviewed, that he has nothing to say for himself, so he steals words from someone else, you know. It's nice to see that starting so early already in Warhol. Yeah, the other thing about Warhol is anyone who works on Warhol realizes that the single worst source on the life of Andy Warhol is Andy Warhol. If there's someone you shouldn't trust, if there's a statement you shouldn't trust, it's Andy Warhol. If he says it is statistically more likely to be untrue than true, except you can usually find him saying X and not X in two different places. So you can always be sure that he will contradict himself in talking about his life.
But still, I think it's really worthwhile. I mean, I hope you were all inspired to maybe look at his books in person. Most of the books are available in paperback copies that are really affordable. Read them, you'll have such a good time. I gave my mother Popism, and my mother grew up in the 60s, but she said, oh my goodness, I didn't know life could be so exciting, and they had a really good time. So she really got into it, and then I gave her philosophy as well, because she just couldn't get enough of it. These books are really very readable, and you'll get a really interesting view, and you have the feeling you get really close to him, even though, as Blake says, it's sort of deceptive. You think he lets you in on something, and then you find out, oh, this might not all have been the way it was, or but that's part of the entertainment. He was just a great entertainer, and that started very early.
Almost immediately. Let's get back. Let's talk a little bit about 62, the radicalism of 1962, and what comes before it in the 50s. I mean, one of the things that's important to realize about Warhol, we've seen him so much that we see him as the pop works as fun and easy and light and obviously good. When they came out, they were incomprehensible to most people. They were as radical works of art, essentially as Marcel Duchamp's Urinal. They were seen as not just radical art, but as non-art. They seemed incomprehensible as works of art.
1962 was the year when he first showed his Campbell's soup cans, And you can imagine, when you first, or actually we can't quite imagine anymore what the world was like before Andy Warhol and before the Campbell's soup cans. And but it really spread his name around the world. He became internationally famous instantly in that moment with the Campbell's soup cans. And so that's why 1962 is such an important date. But he was around before that. He had been working for 15 years, and he was not a young artist anymore in 62. He was 34 at the time. So nowadays, that's, that would be somebody who's either made it or not made it on the art market.
And he hadn't made it. It's important to realize, I think, that he wanted to be an artist, that especially with his training at Carnegie Tech, where he went to art school, they didn't tend to distinguish. In fact, they had as a strong polemic that you shouldn't distinguish between fine art and commercial art, which is very important in understanding Warhol. But they did believe in success in either field having to be ambitious. They really believed that you needed to make it big, to do radical work. And I think that Warhol in the 50s was always disappointed that he wasn't able to become a really major figure in the culture.
Even though he did a lot of provocative work, we can see some works here in the exhibition. You probably saw the male genitals or the feet drawings. That was not something that he could have easily shown in galleries at the time. And we know he tried. He contacted a couple of galleries, but most of the things that was shown in his 50s galleries exhibitions was more, close to popular taste and something that the gallerists felt safe with somehow.
Although I think that the most important thing for understanding Warhol's radicalism in the 50s, and we've talked about this, is the homosexual content in his work. That's really where he thought he could be radical that way, and in fact the society wasn't ready for it at all. And I think that even the things that seemed attractive had a fey quality, a camp quality, that made them complicated and problematic and interesting. And I think that people who were at all attuned to this, especially within gay circles, could understand there was something actually fairly radical in that. So the fact is that in the 50s, Warhol's radicalism isn't in his style, which is the sort of classic modern way to be radical. It's in his content. And that's why he wasn't able to be accepted, I think. Because the world wasn't ready, the art world wasn't ready to understand content is radical without radical style. And after all, what happens in 62 is, by the terms of the time, he does away with style altogether. All the reviews say there's no style in this, it's empty, it's not art, there's only content. And I think that that's a dynamic that's happening in the 50s already.
Yeah, one thing we have to mention though is that he was very successful in advertising work. But in many art historical accounts or many biographies now you read, oh, he was the most famous advertising artist in the 50s in New York. That's not true at all. He was successful in the sense that he made a lot of money and he was able to support himself with that money, or more than support himself. But he was not an outstanding figure in that field. If you read design histories or advertising histories now, his name, hardly comes up as an innovator, or his name comes up because he was in that field and he later became this big name, but not in the 1950s.
He was in the period press. There's a huge trade press about advertising art, and he's barely mentioned. I mean, there are much, much more famous figures, and people, he won several awards. I guess in the end he won 3 awards, but when you look at the list of people who won awards, it was like the caucus race in Alice in Wonderland. Everyone got an award. There were so many awards given out, for best black and white line drawing in a publication of circulation of more than 50,000. I mean, it was hard not to win an award in those annual shows.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, I think, about the books and the 1950s books is that you see both these fields of artistic practice at the time. We have books that are much closer related to his advertising and illustrative works, and then there's the books where he's trying to, or sort of groping his way into fine art, or is maybe considering, will he go into children's book publications, and so that's why this material with this focus on just the book production is really interesting, because it gives you sort of a much complexer view of what he was doing and all the things he was trying out, and trial and error was what much of the 50s was about, I think.
And this brings us back again to this notion that in Pittsburgh especially, because they had a strong, essentially a Bauhaus model in the whole art scene in Pittsburgh, but especially in Carnegie Tech where he went to school, he didn't really recognize, he was trained not to recognize a distinction, for instance, between children's books and high art. He was really trained to try to make those so good that they would count as high art. And I think New York, though, as you pointed out, the Museum of Modern Art did lip service to these ideas. New York was actually a very stratified place, an extremely stratified place, especially with abstract expressionism. So I think that he wasn't able to recognize those stratifications.
Right. I mean, he went to see the exhibitions at MoMA, and at the time, if you've ever looked into the history of exhibitions at MoMA, nowadays they're trying to spread out again, but early in the century they did exhibitions on cave art, cave paintings, they did exhibitions on posters, on, things that at the time there were people who would say, does this belong into an art museum, or or the exhibition in 1949, Modern Art in Your Life, which took a look at the crossover of art and what we might call design, and where you would find it. They had shop window installations in that exhibition. So when Warhol came to New York, he would find venues and very prestigious venues where he's encountered the same thing he had seen in Pittsburgh, but the realities then of selling his art and finding markets for his fine art were a bit, harsher. Yeah.
In fact, I just found out that when Warhol came, Warhol's final trip as a student to New York was in Easter of '49, and the only reason he was allowed to go was because, his mother insisted he go to Easter with her to church, except that they were still working a Julian calendar at their church, because he was Greek Catholic. So he was allowed to go to New York because it didn't interfere with their Easter celebrations, because New York was, of course, Gregorian calendar. But when he was there was an exhibition of the, I'm not going to remember the proper name for it now, the Art Directors Club of New York, I guess it was called, was actually at MoMA that year. Usually it wasn't, but that one year, during exactly the weeks that he was there, that show was at MoMA. So it established a model that, look, someone like me could be at MoMA, and he was kind of wrong in a way about that.
Yeah. Well, initially.
And, he did get to MoMA. Late, though. He got to MoMA later than anyone,
Well, at MoMA, they bought his first, the first drawing that MoMA bought of Andy Warhol's was in 1957, one of his shoe collages. And he would have liked to have given them more, but they didn't. They weren't interested at the time.
They turned, there's nice refusal letters from them. But actually, that's pretty interesting, because MoMA would never buy the equivalent now. That's good evidence for MoMA having a much, much more eclectic taste then than it does now. And likewise with children's books. Now, the other thing that I think is important, very important for understanding what's going on in this room, is his training in outsider art. Outsider art was very important throughout all of modernism in the early part of the 20th century. It hangs on in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is the first place in North America, certainly, to show a work by an outsider artist in a contemporary art show. In 1927, John Kane is shown in Pittsburgh. And Tom Crow's done research on this. I don't know if he talked about it the other day when he was here. But he showed that there was this interest in outsider art in all of modernism, but it dies out in New York, partly because the rich collectors didn't approve of it, and they kill it. They actually fire Alfred Barr briefly because he likes outsider art. and then they sort of rehire him back to a lesser job. But in Pittsburgh, that never changed. Kane came from Pittsburgh. That's right.
The first or big star from Pittsburgh. Really.
And the museum has a Douanier Rousseau show when Warhol's a kid. So outsider art's really important. And I think it's important to understand in this work that it has a strong outsider component, and Warhol would have seen that as avant-garde. So that's another avant-garde strand that Warhol introduces into this work, which is, I think, slightly illegible to us now as avant-garde, and I think was pretty illegible to even to the New York world at its time. It seems quaint and childlike rather than seeming radically reduced and primitive.
And Warhol later became a folk art collector, or actually he did become a folk art collector in the 50s already. Started collecting, and he was one of the, few artists who started his own art collection, actually, at the time. At the time, that was not very common. And some of the other artists would sort of be very skeptical about his art collecting. It was known. I mean, he went out really early to try and buy a work of Jasper Johns in the 50s already, because he really admired Jasper Johns' work, but then he wouldn't or couldn't afford a painting, so he went for a drawing.
It's really important to realize that, there's an image of Warhol that he tried to encourage really throughout most of his life, of this kind of fey, what's the right word, superficial butterfly figure that didn't pay attention to anything, that had a short attention span. It was a kind of adult, if a genius, an accidental genius. He was actually deeply, deeply tied into the most avant-garde, I've used that word 3,000 times tonight, cutting-edge culture, and would go to all of the most important shows. He knew who was showing, he knew where they were showing, he knew who they were, he wanted to be their friends, he wanted to make work like them. He was a deeply sophisticated thinker, reader even, and I think that's important, and of course artist.
Yeah. That is not to say he was an intellectual. I mean, if you walk through this exhibition, well, I don't know if you get the impression that he was an intellectual, but there's also the little library. I don't know if you've been able to go through that. There are some books that for the exhibition, they reconstructed part of his library and they bought the books, and so you can get an idea of what he was interested in, and it's so diverse. It's there are diet books, but then there's also what the school reading he had to do, Shakespeare and Tennessee Williams, maybe already in school, or your Orlando by Virginia Woolf, which is earlier up there in the exhibition as well. So he read constantly basically, but it wasn't all high literature. He would devour biographies by famous people. So, on
his deathbed, unfortunately, that it was his deathbed, he had Kitty Kelly's biography of Frank Sinatra and Cocteau's diaries at the same time. So it gives you some sense of his range. Yeah. I do think it's important to realize that there are weaknesses in this work from this period. This isn't great art. If he had died in '61 and never made the pop art, it's not clear to me that this would have been legible as important work. Yeah. And it's important, I think, to recognize that. Because if you valorize this work too much, then the 60s pop work doesn't make sense in a sense. You have to understand, I think, that there is something, I think I feel this way more strongly than you, but that there's a level of radicalism that hits in '61 that's prepared for by this work, but is also in contradiction to it.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think you can see really well in this exhibition is how he finds his some of his working techniques in the 50s and takes them over into the 1960s and just continues using the techniques that worked out for him. He would experiment with different lines for different drawings. He would experiment with different blotting techniques. Maybe you've heard about his blotted line where he does the original drawing on one piece of paper, then puts it down on the other paper, and then the outcome is a blotted drawing. But there are many variations to this kind of line, and or he works in the hallway over there. You can see the little book that was made with stamps, strawberry stamps, or all sorts of. He cut rubber and then used that as stamp, and I mean that's a technique that would help you not have to repeat the same thing over and over again, and that's the direct antecedent to the silk screens technique that he would just use a year or two later. So yeah, I think that's really nice in this exhibition. You have all of this so close together, and every visitor can really see this and get their own idea of how this developed.
Yeah, I mean, it's because we're talking about the 50s, it's as though the whole exhibition is that, but of course this is also in the exhibition.
Yeah.
And there are little things that are amazingly, I mean, one of the things I'm discovering, surprise, surprise, since I started at the beginning, was working on the early years, you find, maybe biographers just force this onto the material, but you find links from early to much later. And one of the things that I love is, as you've pointed out, the little, what would you call it? Where he writes his names on some of his earliest self-published books. Is it on the first book? Which book does it start with? There's a little glue-on label.
Yeah, well, here in the exhibition you can see it in A's in alphabet.
Right.
There's the folder that the pages are kept in is a little wax paper folder, and it looks really whimsy. And the great decorative element on that is the little sticker. A
little classic sticker like you used to get in any stationery store, that you'd put your name on and stick it onto something. And then you see, in that case, one of the most interesting things in this show is, you could call it a maquette for a book about Marilyn, although it's just little tiny pieces of Marilyn's face that's in that long, skinny vitrine there, and it uses the shape of that tiny little sticker. Yeah. So from his very, very first self-published books, a little trivial gesture turns out to be something that's in his mind, and he uses it much later.
He goes back to it. And what I like about the early sticker, it looks so, offhand, but he goes and puts it in the typewriter, and he writes, A is an alphabet by Andy and Corky, and it looks like a student's work or something. But there's so much care that actually went into that, and when you see the later work, it might come back to you that, oh, he really was into this shape, and this meant really something to him. I
think that first label is important also because it's an early example of a ready-made used by Warhol, something just taken from the world and presented and used as, in this case, an art supply rather than a finished work. And the idea of the ready-made, I think, is really important. Warhol owns a Duchamp urinal later on, buys it or trades his art for it fairly early. And he would have known Duchamp's work extremely well when he was probably still in high school, because this amazing local Pittsburgh woman called Betty Rockwell, who opened one of the most impressive galleries in North America at the time, called Outlines Gallery, owned Duchamp's, a deluxe version of Duchamp's Boîte en Valise. Duchamp's, this box that held little miniatures of all of Duchamp's works that Duchamp produced. She owned that, and she showed Duchamp. So Warhol would have almost certainly known Duchamp from incredibly early on. And I think one could argue that Duchamp hovers behind Warhol's work throughout his career, and they knew each other in the end. In fact, when Warhol and he were supposed to do a 24-hour movie of a day in the life of Marcel Duchamp, they're going to start working on it. Warhol gets shot. They don't do it. He gets better in the fall, and Duchamp dies in September of that year. So this project never gets off the ground.
Well, another thing I think that you can really start watching in the 50s is his collaborations. He's always someone who's not just looking for making things either easier technically in doing drawings or prints, but also for finding someone to work with because it's fun, for one thing, and to sort of maybe shift or share the burden of producing something. So the 50s are actually really great for watching these collaborations evolve and then break off as the friendship maybe breaks off. And then he finds somebody else who will write some really great poems for him. And if you walk through the exhibition, this aspect of collaboration is really, really important, and we have an expert on collaboration here tonight. And it's one of the most fascinating aspects in Warhol's oeuvre, I think, and very often people will be derogative about it and say, oh, he just copied here and there, and but he was like a sponge. He did with other people's stimulation as he did with art around him. He just soaked it all up and maybe let it sink in, and then something really surprising would come out.
Oh yeah, so I'm going to give a plug to my own website, because today, in honor of this talk, my item was, I showed a page from the Gold Book, which are these amazing, wonderful, offset printed images by Andy Warhol on gold paper. And I also reproduced an invitation to an Ojala show from 1947, I guess it is, from that Outlines gallery that is, surprise, surprise, offset printed onto gold paper. So you see this sponging that Warhol does from early on.
Yeah. And what's to me surprising, I'm working on 1950s drawings right now. He was a hoarder of materials, of objects, of everything. When maybe you've heard when he died, there was an auction that lasted a couple of days, and they tried to sell off a lot of his. So he accumulated a lot of material during his life, but he also collected material that he would use later in his life. He would collect things over a couple of years and then go back to it later, sort of like a work archive, like many artists probably have, but you wouldn't really maybe associate Warhol with such a structured or system, that he would have these files and say, oh, I'm thinking of a project on that subject, and let's see what I have on that subject, and then have this material, go through it, and come up with something that looks uniquely Warholian.
And I think he had the most phenomenal visual memory. I don't think he had to go through his archive in a sense, because he remembered it. I mean, he already knew what he was looking for when he went for the piece of paper, because as far as I can tell, he must have remembered every image he saw, because you see him looking back. In 1964, he does the 13 Most Wanted Men's project for the New York World's Fair, and I've discovered that phrase, the most wanted man, is in a publicity brochure he gets for Guys and Dolls, the musical, in does anyone remember the year of that? It's 54, I think? Earlier than that. So it's ridiculous. Of course, in this insane archive that exists at the Andy Warhol Museum, which is the force hovering over all of us who work on Warhol, sure enough, there is this brochure he got when he went to see Guys and Dolls, and you open it up, and there's a picture, in fact, of Marlon Brando, and it says, he may not be wanted by the FBI, but he's sure one of our most wanted men. And that then, 8 years later, he remembers that well enough to go back to it. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. The timing of our hesitation is excellent, because we should take some questions.
Take some questions, right.
Could you discuss some of the influence of his mother on his work?
That's a very good question.
That's probably worth its own book, if you look into it. Well, she moved in with him in 1952, and she stayed with him until 1971. So they were roommates for a long time. And he put her to work, like he put his friends to work. She had this very particular handwriting that she's known for, and you see some samples of in the gallery, but we just discussed it earlier. In Warhol literature, it's always said that she did all the writing, or his assistant Nathan Gluck, and I think we both agree he had training as a graphic artist, and that's the first thing you learn. You learn different handwritings, and so we think, both of us think, that he was able to imitate her handwriting.
So when you see something that says by Julia Warhol, it could just as easily be written by him.
Or by the assistant. But initially it was her handwriting. And then we have this wonderful little book, Holy Cats by Andy Warhol's mother. So which was published in 1960. So towards the end of the decade.
Nina's being too modest. She discovered it was published in 1960. Everyone before had thought it was published much earlier than that.
Much earlier, but I wasn't. That wasn't my point.
I know, but I wanted to make it anyways.
Thank you.
Blow your horn a little bit.
But the point was that that's my conjecture, that he started using her as sort of a second label towards the end, because he publishes, or he puts out advertising work under her name. But it's not Julia Warhol that it appears under, but Andy Warhol's mother. So his name is always in there.
It is. That's a nice idea, that it's a second brand.
And it's about
under the Warhol.
It's about the time when he's he's sort of trying to get into the high art market, but he still wants to keep a foot in the advertising work. And so, one of her works gets an award again, and so that is my conjecture. But
it's not even clear whether the award, when they gave the award, they were really giving it to someone, to her. Yeah. It's clear in the phrasing of the word is also, the award goes to Andy Warhol's mother, not to Julia Warhol. Yeah. So it's a strange...
Right.
The only other thing I want to say about her is that in his circle, when they talk about her, they often bill her as this kind of old country babushka. But when you do more digging into her, she was clearly always seen in her own world, before Andy was famous, as an artistic eccentric. So though she put on the babushka shtick, she was actually a person of incredible interest and character. And that's, I think, where Warhol got a lot of his character from. Her last name was Zavacki. And the Zavakis, much more than the Warholas, were wild and crazy people, and still are. I say, we being taped? Yes, we are. But they know they are. When you visit with the Zavakis, they're all incredibly eccentric. And that, I think, is where Warhol got that model from.
But she also kept his back free, I mean, she did his household, she did the shopping, she did the cooking, she did the cleaning. So, other men have to get married for that, and she was around and did all that for free. So,
I think this gentleman had a question first. You had your hand up before anyone else, was it? Hang on, we want the microphone. No, we just want you to have a microphone.
The early show that he did in LA, did that influence his gallery access in New York?
Sure, it was a big success, succès de scandale, but a big success. But by then he was already getting to be a well-known figure as a fine artist, so it didn't depend on that. But it certainly was part of this snowball that grew incredibly quickly. But once he came up with the formula for pop art, people who really knew what was what realized something radical, extremely radical, was happening at that very moment. But the Ferris show was his first solo show as a fine artist. Of course, he'd had solo shows in the other decorative art mode, but his first show as a pop artist is in Ferris Gallery in the summer of '62.
Since Whistler's mother is here in Williamstown right now, I'm wondering if there is any possibility that signing something Andy Warhol's mother is related to that title, Whistler's mother, and that exhibit at the Clark does a great job of bringing out the reception of Whistler's painting and what it meant in the United States, and so I think that might be an interesting...
I think it's actually even an art historical topos. Me coming from Germany, it's Dürer's mother. It's also, it's equal, I mean, it's even older than Whistler's mother. Dürer's mother is like such a looming figure in art history. So I think the artist's mother is a topos, and I'm pretty sure he was aware of that and used that. And it worked really well, because nowadays you find people going back to this, what was the function of his mother, or, oh yeah, she was the one with the handwriting. It's really easy to remember for people. So I think he was aware of the marketing, effect of that too. Yeah, and Whistler's mother for this country, of course, is the big model, right?
The big mama.
Yeah.
Although I have to admit, my heart almost broke today when I saw the fabulous scholarship that they did for the Whistler Mother show, and they traced the 11 venues that the painting went to, and it did not go to Pittsburgh. I was so disappointed in that. But Cleveland is pretty close. It went to Cleveland and Toledo, so that's pretty good. So Warhol there could have been some resonance from that. But unfortunately, he could not have actually seen Whistler's Mother. But it was, I'm old enough to remember my grandparents talking about that painting as they were very simple people with no art historical background at all, but that counted as the painting. The two paintings that mattered for their generation, and therefore for Warhol's generation, were Gainsborough's Blue Boy and Whistler's Mother. Those were the only paintings they knew, and the Mona Lisa. So it had a resonance that he would have known for sure,
I've heard that Warhol's mother wouldn't agree for him moving to New York, wouldn't agree unless he lived with Philip Pearlstein. Did you run into that?
Yes, that is a story that is told. Is the best I can do. That's not the kind of thing that gets recorded in documents, and I really like it when I can get like a nice, crisp archival document. But yeah, that's clearly the case that they didn't want their little, he was younger than everyone else. They didn't want their little Andy moving off to the big bad city where he might be corrupted. The idea of him being corrupted by anyone is sort of funny, but Philip had to babysit him.
And another thing I've always wondered about, Warhol in his self-portraits and a lot of the interviews, so forth, he just presents a facade, a mask. You don't get to any kind of persona. And then he posed for that Alice Neal portrait, which is pretty brutal.
And for Avedon, the greatest photographer and one of the great figurative painters, both represent him at that moment when he's at his ugliest. And he wasn't fond of being ugly, He, what to say about that? Presentation, self-presentation is one of his greatest art forms, arguably his greatest art form. That who he was mattered as much as a work of art to him, I think, in a kind of inchoate way, but to us certainly, mattered as much as any object he ever made,
I was going to ask, since you're writing a biography on him, I'm a little interested in his personal life. Was he well accepted personally, socially? Was he a happy person? Did he run into problems because of his lifestyle? What was he like growing up and developing into this very famous artist?
I think he changed a lot over life, and like all of us, he was many different people, too many different people. Being gay and discovering you were gay in 1947, 48 in Pittsburgh there could not have been a worse place in the world just about to discover that you were gay. Homophobia was institutionalized in absolutely the most brutal way in that town. So he had to get out of Pittsburgh, once he decided he was gay. The story of homosexual culture in Pittsburgh, which is just now being told, is extremely interesting. Everyone in the 50s, since this is a talk about the 50s, said he was the sweetest person. Again and again and again, people say that he was sweet. And some of the people who he knew in the 50s who continue to know him say he never stopped being that Andy underneath it all, but he stopped being that in public, and he could also be a mean person. He was not uniformly nice, I think. There were many people who he hurt, but he was interesting.
But there were also a lot of breakups of friendships, but it's, of course, it's hard to tell what the friendships broke up over, because, once he got famous, there was money involved, it may very often have been, quarrels over money, and so it's hard to tell if it was his personality. Some people felt used because he was always, as I said, like a sponge. He asked for ideas, and some people later on felt that they hadn't been, paid well enough or paid at all.
And he had kind of a tragic death, if I remember.
Not particularly, all premature deaths are inherently tragic.
But something went wrong at the hospital, or?
My take on that, and I will continue to research this, but I've talked to doctors directly involved is, unfortunately, one of the reasons never to have an operation is that every operation has a small but not negligible number of people who just never get over it, who never make it. And as far as I can tell, he was just that crazy 0.1% of idiopathic death without any explanation. There are explanations that have been suggested, but when you look deeply into them, none of them seem quite right. Certain people don't survive operations, and it was a trivial operation. No, it wasn't so trivial. Actually, when you look into it in detail, there were reasons why it was a more complicated operation than we think. It should have been a trivial operation on his gallbladder. But his innards had been so destroyed by the shooting in '68 that no operation, he was full of scar tissue, he was a mess inside. So no operation was trivial on him.
You mentioned John Cage.
Did I? I'm glad I did. I didn't remember that.
Was there any connection between, did he like avant-garde music? Is there any connection in any of his work that I could find?
Yes, a huge connection. I mentioned earlier this Outlines Gallery that people know very little about, that we're just now finding out a lot about. They gave Cage some of his first ever concerts. One of his first ever prepared piano concerts was in Pittsburgh. We know Warhol went to it. Cage and Cunningham, Merce Cunningham and Cage, actually had an apartment together in Pittsburgh in the 1940s. Really? Warhol would have seen them essentially functioning as a semi-out gay couple. The influence of that on a very young gay man must have been huge. The combination of avant-gardism and homosexuality that they would have represented must have been extraordinary. And then since 1986, Benjamin Buchloh was drawing comparisons between the serial imagery in Warhol, which starts in the 50s and the 40s already, and John Cage. So yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is more connection than even we knew between the two of them.
You mentioned that he was shot, and it sounded like why was he shot? What was that all about?
That's a huge question, which I sort of won't go into because let's try to talk about the 50s. He was shot by a woman called Valerie Solanas, who was an extreme feminist activist, but also a schizophrenic. Unfortunately for poor Andy, he was actually a kind of consolation prize. She didn't set out to shoot him, but the guy who she wanted to shoot, her first choice, wasn't in. So she went to Andy as her second choice to kill that day. And the fact that he survived, you will have to buy my book because I will have great detail on the miracle of his survival. But let's get a question about the 50s if we could.
I am interested in the relationship between Jamie Wyatt and Warhol. Could you help me with that? What started the relationship and the friendship?
You know what? One of the things about doing a biography, I am in the middle of doing my biography, which means there are areas that are surprisingly empty in my mind. I think I'm going to leave that till next time I speak here, and I will answer your question when I know something about it. I will say one thing. Jamie Wyatt showed in Pittsburgh several times, so he would have seen his work from early on.
I had a question about the 1950s. Nina, one of the things that you revealed in your research that's in your essay in the exhibition catalog was that Warhol, the timing of the books from the 1950s, they were all coming out around Christmas time, and you were able to uncover that. I wonder if you were able to find out if he gave them away as Christmas presents, because the numbering is so weird, and we have all these stories about him giving gifts away to art directors to get jobs, but I wonder if you could talk about, Christmas gifts and these books functioning as that, and anything else you found out about how many of them he gave away, or he kept them and gave them away many years later, and how he distributed them.
No, I mean, that's a very good question, and I did write a bit about that, about the material, and but it has stayed with me. When you write something, you don't have to have the final answer, and since I'm still working on the 50s, I keep an open eye out for answers to that question. I've found a few indications. I mean, I claim that, or I sort of put out the hypothesis that maybe he did one of the promotional books every year so as to have Christmas gifts for his clients, for his friends, and because it struck me initially that there seems to have been a new one almost every year in the 50s. So, you think, okay, he has this annual thing, and then there were 2 or 3 anecdotes where people said, oh, he gave me this for Christmas. And it was different books, so, it seemed like a very good moment to come up with something really special. During the year, he would give his clients cards, postcards, or little gifts that he'd made, but, Christmas had to be something special. So, we don't really have confirmation of many of the dates. Many of the books are not dated, so the dates you see in the exhibition are very often, indirect conclusions of the research that's been done over the years. We don't really know much about the number of copies in many cases, so there's still work left to be done. And, I found a few more things since I wrote that bit, but there's still a lot of work out there for new and younger generations. And, I hope this exhibition is an invitation, since there are so many students here in Williamstown, and so many highly qualified students, to pick up somewhere and dig deep, as Blake is doing for the biography, because so rewarding, and there's still so much to be discovered. It's a lot of work, but it's fun. And thank you for the question. Yeah.
Nina, can I ask you a question? Would it be possible to get even close to an inventory of all the extant copies? Do they just come up out of nowhere all the time? Are they sort of floating out there?
Well, fortunately, for a few
copies
years,
of the books.
Right. Fortunately, for a few years now, auction catalogs are online. So, starting in the 90s. So you can sort of trace which books are out there, and, but certain copies reappear. If they were in a private collection, they will reappear. Great are the ones that are in museums or libraries, because they don't wander around so much. So I'm trying to see as many copies as I can. But a lot of these books are still in private collections, so you have to be lucky that somebody tells you about them or they reappear. And the great thing about these 50s books is really each one is a unique book, even though they were really printed very often on cheap paper. They were, it's an offset print, nothing really special, but each of them was dedicated by Warhol to the person he gave them to, or they were hand colored, so each one is a little different. They were collated by hand. That means very often the sequence of pages is different. So they're really, each one is a perfect little piece of art, and they're great. Great as collectibles, and the prices are going up. This exhibition will not help. So if you were thinking of buying one, do it now. The sooner the better.
Oh, but if you're thinking of selling one, hang on for a while.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, while I'm an avid museum goer, I am not, versed in art and art history. So in looking at this exhibit, I couldn't predict from anything I saw there what would have led to, the breakthrough in the early 60s. Could you tell me what I missed and what I should be looking at? How could anybody have predicted that Warhol would have become this Warhol?
That's an excellent, excellent question. I think I've thought a lot about that. I think there are little threads that we've been trying to get at where you see it, but I think what you see is someone desperate to make important avant-garde art and doing it in a very complicated way. That is, the gay themes are very special to Warhol. That, he's right, that's radical. No one can read them at the time. There's no way to understand those. When you make art about gay subjects now, it's obviously part of the dialogue of contemporary art. At the time, there was no way for anyone except Andy Warhol, in a sense, to understand what he was doing. So what he had to do was to find a way, and they were people were blinded by the cuteness of his style, in a way. What he had to do was, so he had content and style at that moment. This is my slightly simplified reading. What he had to do was find a way to jettison all notions of style, so that all he was left with was this pure nugget of content. And when he first does it, it's about pop culture, right? It's the Campbell soup can, it's Marilyn, but pretty quickly gay topics come back into his work. And even Marilyn is a kind of camp topic. So I think he's trying to figure out what avant-gardism is, how he can be a great artist. I believe that from incredibly young, he wanted to be a great artist. I mean, looking at his college art textbook, seeing him underline things, circle things is just beautiful. Because you really feel him desperately wanting to be great. And he figures it out. But I think with most artists, there's a moment where they have a eureka moment, and the stuff that comes before doesn't really predict it quite perfectly, you know. I don't think with Blue Period Picasso, you would be able to predict 1908 Cubism, you know, completely. Nina, do you have a better answer for?
No. I mean, you know, there's when you go back to the 50s, there are certain things that, I mean, to me seem like precursors to what's going on later, or, you know, how he approaches creating a work. A lot of these drawings are based on photographs.
Yes,
we haven't
that's
discussed
important.
that. So that's something that's also connected to what I call, he has this archive of motifs that he can go back to and work with. He works a lot with photographs. And then that becomes the really supposedly radical thing that happens in the silk screens. But, you know, in the drawings, I mean, you can't really tell that many of these are based on photographs if you go past them. And for many, the photographs are popping up now, and it's really, once you find them, it's really an aha moment that you say, oh, this is so obvious. I mean, of course he would have come across this, because he goes to Life magazine, he goes to Harper's Bazaar magazine. He has his sources, and he had his clippings at home that he worked with. So that's really, I mean, you wouldn't think that looking at the material. And here, of course, it's right in your face.
Yeah, I mean, the photographic stuff I think is incredibly important, and it was very forbidden at the time in fine art. It was contentious. Warhol's illustrational style is based to a huge extent, as everyone at the time knew, on Ben Shahn style. Ben Shahn had a solo show at Museum of Modern Art in '47, and one of the contentious aspects of it was his use of photography. In the reviews, that was seen as really, really problematic. So when Warhol, it's not Warhol using silkscreen that matters. Warhol was trained to use silkscreen already in college, extensively.
Right.
It's the photo silkscreen
There was
that
an
matters.
important exhibition in Pittsburgh about silkscreen.
Yeah, that's right. There were several exhibitions, in fact. One of his teachers was one of the first people. I mean, silkscreen was new when he was a student. It was new and hot, but not photo silkscreen. And in fact, the National Serigraph, which is a fancy word for silkscreen society, had as one of its rules, you could not use a photographic source, and you had to pull the print yourself by hand. What does Warhol do in 1962? He uses photographic sources, and he lets any old assistant pull the photographic print. So he does everything you're not supposed to do. And I think we see some of that in the 50s work, him breaking rules. That's really important.
Yeah.
We could go on all night, and I think we would all love that. So I am going to invite us downstairs outside on the patio to have some drinks, mingling, and some more conversation. I want to thank Blake and Nina. This has been really wonderful.